Reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that's going to determine what the future will bring. Those words were spoken by Larry McDonald, Congressman Larry McDonald, who was on Flight 007. And I've simply paraphrased that, and I start my programs every day with that statement, 4 hours a day. And I think it's vitally important to realize that reality usually is sort of laughed at. People do not see what's going on. And illusion is what most people accept. But if we are to survive as a free people, people are going to have to learn the truth. And certainly it was Lord Byron who says, "'Tis strange but truth is always strange than fiction." And Daniel Webster said, "There's nothing so powerful as truth, but often nothing so strange." It was Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who back in 1928 wrote a book called Propaganda. And this is what he said. He opened his book on propaganda, and he said this: "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power in our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of." Now, public health officials, dentists, and most doctors will tell you that water fluoridation has done a wonderful thing, that oral health in America is better today than it was 50 years ago, and that this is simply safe and it's effective. Water fluoridation is safe and effective. And of course, one of the problems we get into is we try to argue with them but we argue the wrong issues. And I think the first thing we have to concede is that oral health is far better today in America than it was 50 years ago. I know one of my best friends is a dentist, and for years we would discuss this, and he'd say, "Look, 30 years ago, why so many of the children that I took care of had dental cavities. We just don't see that today." And that's absolutely true. But the issue that we have forgotten is oral health is far better today than it was 50 years ago in communities that fluoridate their water. But oral health is also far better today than it was 50 years ago in communities that don't fluoridate their water. In fact, in countries like almost every country in Europe, oral health has progressively improved over the last 50 years. In fact, in Eastern Germany, when it was under Soviet control, under communist control, they had forced water fluoridation. Once they stopped water fluoridation, the oral health of the young people there actually improved once they stopped fluoridating the water. You can go into these inner cities of San Francisco and New York that have fluoridated their water for 30 or 40 years, and you have terrible dental caries among the children. Why is oral health better? Why? Very simply. Dental caries is a communicable bacterial disease. You get dental caries simply because you have bacteria in your mouth, and if there's any sugar there, why the bacteria then begin to produce acid, and the acid erodes the dental enamel, and that's what's giving you dental caries. That's really what it's all about. Why is oral health better today than it was 50 years ago? Why? Very simply because they put fluoride in our toothpaste, and fluoride is an excellent bactericidal agent, and it kills the bacteria. We also have fluoridated tape. If you floss your teeth, that most of the tape that they use is fluoridated. They have mouthwashes, and mouthwashes kill the bacteria. And the reason we have better oral health today is because people use these things. But what about the effect of water fluoridation? We're told that it is effective and safe. Well, it certainly is no more effective in the communities where they have fluoridated water than the communities where they don't have fluoridated water, because if you check the two, you have identical oral health. But what about safety? Well, if you look at what's going on in our society, Over the last 50 years, infertility has increased considerably. And of course, if you study this, you'll find that men have lower sperm counts. Their sperm have lower motility. In communities that have fluoridated water, they have lower fertility rates than in communities that don't have fluoridated water. We find among young people, 1 in 6 American children today has a neurodevelopmental or behavioral abnormality. We find increasing incidence of autism, ADD, ADHD, Asperger's disease, learning disabilities, reading disabilities, study disabilities. If you look at the scholastic achievement tests of our children, 50 years ago, we had some of the smartest kids in the entire world. I mean, people who came to the United States were real go-getters. They were the cream of the world had immigrated here for an opportunity to be free. But today, on scholastic achievement tests, when the children reach the 4th grade and complete the 4th grade, and then they compare them with children from throughout the rest of the world, our kids don't do very well. By the time you get through the 8th grade, our children are doing very poorly. And by the time our young people graduate, and the average from our high schools, and we compare them with schools throughout the rest of the world, our kids can't compete at all. Of those children who go on to college, almost half of them have to take bonehead English, or they have to take bonehead mathematics. And when they graduate from college, they really, in many respects, some of them, of course, will be quite good, but why is it that we're bringing in so many people, engineers and computer specialists from other countries, because they work for less? Or because, of course, maybe we can't compete? We've noticed over the last 50 years a considerable increase in cancer. In fact, there have been a number of studies that have shown that if you compare communities that have fluoridated water with communities that don't have fluoridated water, the general incidence of cancer is increased, and Dr. Yamianis and Dr. Burke actually found that in their studies. Dr. Burke was the #1 man in cancer research at the NCI. I had the privilege of talking to him back in 1980 before he retired. And then, of course, there's been a number of studies that have shown that boys, adolescent boys, 7 or 8 years old, from fluoridated areas have a much higher incidence of osteogenic sarcoma, which is a terrible disease, and yet young pre-adolescent boys have a much higher incidence of osteogenic sarcoma in areas where they have fluoridated water than in areas without fluoridated water. There's an incidence of hip fractures, almost twice the incidence of hip fractures in postmenopausal women in communities that have fluoridated water, and then, of course, we find increased incidence of arthritis, almost double the incidence of heart disease in communities that fluoridate their water, incidence of dental fluorosis. In areas where the children have fluoridated water, the girls go through their menarche probably 6 to 8 months earlier. In fact, in many areas, we're finding girls beginning to menstruate, when they're 9 or 10 years old. Never used to do that. Does this have anything to do with water fluoridation, or is this just a coincidence? Well, those of you who got our kit today, there was an article there from the Reader's Digest. I don't know if you saw it. It's from the October 24th issue of Time, the October 24th issue of Time magazine. And I hope you'll read the article very closely. It's about the problem they're having up in Bellingham, Washington, where they're trying to get through water fluoridation. The people who support water fluoridation have spent almost $2.5 million. The people who oppose water fluoridation only have $15 million on their side. Looks like the opponents of water fluoridation are going to win this one. What's significant about that article, though, it points out that there are 7,000 employees of the Environmental Protection Agency who have petitioned the Environmental Protection Agency through their union to stop all water fluoridation because it isn't safe. Now, you would think that if 7,000 employees of the EPA had petitioned the EPA to stop water fluoridation, because these are the people who are supposed to be protecting our health, you would think that that would be covered by every major news magazine. It would be talked about on the evening news and on the afternoon news, and Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and the conservatives would be talking about that, but Only place I've seen it is in the article you have, October 24th, Time magazine. Just a very casual mention of it. But don't you think this is significant? Is this issue of water fluoridation really important? Yes, it's very important. It's important because if we can convince the average American that somebody is endangering their health intentionally, is endangering the health of their children and their grandchildren intentionally, we may begin to get them to question so much that they're being told by the controlled media. And believe me, the media is controlled. And if you doubt that, you need to get a book we carry called The New Media Monopoly, written by a professor up in Berkeley, a left-wing professor, as a matter of fact. I don't care whether he's left-wing or right-wing. We're in search of the truth. He started researching media control back in 1983 when there were 50 major corporations that dominated the American media. And in the last issue of his book, entitled The New Media Monopoly, published in 2004, there were 5 major corporations that controlled 95% of the media in America. And that was Bertelsmann, which is not an American corporation, but it controls the American media, and Fox, which is controlled by a man who is an Australian and only recently became an American citizen, publishes many of the Christian books, undermining the Christian faith here in America. And that is Fox, and then of course we have Disney, we have Viacom, and we have AOL Time Warner. And they dominate the media, determine what most Americans read, hear, and see. And the fact that you're not hearing about what the EPA scientists are pleading, trying to get the word out that the American people are being poisoned, the fact you don't hear about that is simply a reflection of the degree of control that today exists over what the American people think. Well, what is fluorine? Fluorine is the most active element known to man. And it is toxic. It's almost as toxic as mercury. Mercury is the most toxic substance we know, but fluorine and fluoride compounds come in a close second. They can certainly eat right through fluorine. A gas will eat right through steel. You use it to etch glass. It's used in all sorts of smelting: aluminum, beryllium, copper, coal, silver, magnesium, nickel, iron, steel, and zinc. We could not have an industrial society without fluoride and fluoride compounds. It's used on computer panel boards. It's used as a bactericidal agent. It is an excellent bactericidal agent. It'll kill the bacteria on contact. That's why we put it in our mouth. But why are we swallowing it? If it'll kill bacteria, what does it do to us? And how does it kill the bacteria? It is the essential ingredient in Cipro. You know what Cipro is? This is this new antibiotic, and if you take it, and of course they say it's specific for anthrax, but of course it'll rupture your tendons. And if you take it and you're out there playing tennis or something, you'll rupture your Achilles tendon, you'll rupture your shoulder tendons, because the fluoride attacks the collagen in your body. Of course, fluoride is essential to enriching uranium. You can't have uranium or uranium nuclear weapons or nuclear plants without fluoride. It's an essential element in Freon that was outlawed a few years ago. It's essential in phosphate fertilizers. They use it in flux, and that's how you, of course, get the metals to flow so easily if you're doing soldering. And of course, it's in halothane. Halothane is an anesthetic. Years ago, we used to have our patients given halothane. My anesthesiologists give halothane. 2 of my anesthesiologists have died of pancreatic carcinoma here in the last 3 or 4 years. It's used in high-octane gasoline. It's an excellent insecticide. I mean, you simply spray this on insects and they die because it interferes with their whole metabolic process. And that's what you're drinking on a regular basis. It's an excellent rat poison. My goodness, you just put it out for the rats and the gophers and it'll kill them dead as a doornail. And that's what they're putting in your drinking water. It's used in rocket fuel, sarin nerve gas, which is such a deadly nerve gas. Scotchgard. Actually, Scotchgard products were wonderful. You couldn't stain them, but of course, to the credit of the producer, and I've forgotten, I think it was 3M, they found that, of course, it also produced eye deformities, and they actually took the Scotchgard products off the market because of the potential liability that would be coming down the line. But, of course, they never stretched that because the active ingredient in that was fluoride. It's certainly in psychotropic drugs, Prozac, Luvox, Zoloft. All of these, of course, are have fluoride, which is the active ingredient that makes them work on your brain. It's in Teflon, your non-stick pans, and of course you get a little dose of fluoride every time you use it. Of course, it's in your toothpaste, your mouthwash. Fluoride is key to the survival of an industrialized society, and when used wisely, it can be a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, it is not being used wisely. So let's give you the background. The fluoride, most of what we have, comes from something called cryolite. It was originally imported from Greenland, and back in 1855 in Europe, it was found that fluoride emissions from the factories in Europe and the smelters were causing European workers to get ill, and the areas around the plants. The crops would die, the trees would die, the animals would become ill, and many of the workers, of course, on the farms would become ill. In 1925, Johns Hopkins scientists began working with fluoride, and they found that they fed it to rats, their teeth became brittle. How many people do you know who've had teeth that have broken off, I mean, teeth never used to break, but so often today people's teeth will break in America. They're much more brittle than they ever were before. I wonder why that is. In 1930, there was a Danish public health official named Rome, who of course was assigned by his government to study the effect of cryolite or fluoride poisoning on the workers. And he found they developed neurotoxic changes. In other words, it attacked their nervous system. They got pulmonary fibrosis, they got arthritis, they got infirmity, they got skeletal fibrosis, they got kidney disease. And then in 1930, in a place called the Meuse Valley, there where they had a large smelter, they had a very, very cold spell. Now, ordinarily, of course, when you have a smelter and the smoke comes out the chimney and it just goes up in the air and dissipates over the hills and is gone. But in this instance, of course, the cold air descended and the air couldn't get out of the valley. 60 people died and hundreds were ill. And so in Europe, they were beginning to recognize that this was a dangerous substance and you were going to have to handle it entirely different than they were. By 1935, while we were operating our smelters here in the United States, and of course the aluminum industry, which was controlled by the Mellons, and there were a lot of lawsuits that were being brought against American aluminum companies and fertilizer companies. And the Mellons had an institute, and they figured we've got to do something. We've got a lot of lawsuits coming down the line. So one of their employees, a man named Gerald Cox, began looking for what that mysterious factor that prevents dental caries, dental cavities. In 1936, he announced that he'd found it was, and the item that prevents dental caries is called fluoride. In 1937, they published an article that says the case for fluoride should be considered proved. In other words, fluoride will prevent dental cavities. And ladies and gentlemen, that's true. If you put it in a toothpaste, it'll kill the bacteria. But what happens when you ingest that fluoride? Well, in 1937, the Dr. Rome, who I talked about earlier, the public health official from Denmark, published a book called Fluoride Toxicity, an interesting study in thought control, is to try to get a copy of that today. It was published here in America, but the copy seemed to have pretty well disappeared. By 1943, the United States was in the middle of the Second World War, and we were in a crash program to develop the Manhattan Project, to develop the atomic bomb. And essential to develop the atomic bomb was to enrich uranium, and to enrich uranium, you needed fluoride. And so they had secret projects. They had it in Florida, they had it in New Jersey, where they were beginning to enrich the uranium. And of course, in the areas surrounding those plants, why the crops were dying and the animals were dying. And these people were beginning to bring lawsuits against the various factories, DuPont and the others who were doing this. And then there at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, why there were a lot of illness among the people. General Groves was in charge of the Manhattan Project, and he said, look, the most important thing is we win this war, and we've got to somehow convince people that there's nothing to worry about from our use of fluoride. And so they hired a man named Harold Hodge. And Dr. Harold Hodge had worked with the CIA, and had worked with big business. He was the president of the Society of Toxicologists, very high up with the National Academy of Sciences. He, of course, in later years supervised the plutonium experiments, where they used these grotesque experiments and poisoned and killed so many of our young children just to see what would happen with the plutonium. And of course, he was the one who established the daily safe levels of fluoride. And he simply lied. Dr. Harold Hodge is one of the greatest villains of all time because millions of people have died because of Harold Hodge, CIA agent extraordinary, associated with the business industries. And if you'd like to check what I'm telling you, it comes from a book called The Fluoride Deception by Chris Bryson. I'd recommend it too. But they had to come up with some sort of a scam. And so it was in 1945, they began a program to prove that water fluoridation would prevent dental caries. And it was carried out in a place called Newburgh, New York, with a controlled city called Kingston, New York. It was set up by the U.S. Public Health Service, which most of you believe is there to protect your public health, but, well, don't necessarily believe everything that you're told. Anyway, the trial started in 1945. It was trialed for one purpose, to convince you that water fluoridation was great, because after all, if they're going to put it in your water, why, there couldn't possibly be any harm from fluoride. They wouldn't put it in your water if it was harmful. In 1948, the day before Halloween, on October 30th, in a place called Donora, Pennsylvania, there was another big smelter, and it was a valley, and of course the cold air came in. There was an inversion layer, and the smelter smoke permeated the village. There was a football game that night. Most of the people were at the football game, but the smoke kept getting deeper and darker, and well, 20 people died that night. Many died later. Many got pulmonary fibrosis. Dozens went to the hospital. 6,000 people were injured. One of the men who was there that night wrote this poem. I have felt the fog in my throat, the misty hand of death caress my face. I've wrestled with a frightful foe who strangled me with wisps of gray fog lace. Now in the eyes, since I have died, the bleak bare hills rise in stupid might, with scars of their slavery embedded deep, and the people still live in the poisonous night. U.S. Public Health Service sent a team in and said, it has nothing to do with fluoride. Oh, we don't know why all these people died. We don't know all these people are sick. We don't know why all these people have pulmonary fibrosis, but we're from the government, and we can assure you that fluoride had nothing to do with it. CDC that sent in a team said the same thing. Private people came in and tested the people, found out they had fluoride toxicity, tried to sue the local smelter, but of course nothing came out of it, because when you try to sue the people with all the money, well, they get their lawyers. In fact, they even set up a team of lawyers. They were known as the fluoride lawyers, and they were trained on how to handle the fluoride suit so that nothing was ever done to the companies that were poisoning people all across America. And then in 1950, 5 years after the Kingston-Newburgh water fluoridation program was set up, why, the United States Public Health Service was taken over by a man named Oscar Ewing. Now, Oscar Ewing, I think, was the Secretary of Health. He was a political party. He was actually a lawyer from Alcoa, the aluminum company of America, that ran the smelters that were poisoning people across America. And Oscar Ewing, with no background in medicine at all, told the U.S. Public Health Service to stop the study, or at least report temporarily on the study in Newburgh and Kingston. And they came out, and of course this was to see how safe it was, but after 5 years they came out and said, 65% reduction in dental caries. This is the greatest thing of all time. Why, water fluoridation is going to transform the country, and we're not going to have any dental caries here in America again. And at that point, Oscar Ewing hired the master propagandist. His name was Edward Bernays, and I read you earlier, this was Sigmund Freud's nephew. Edward Bernays, of course, was a really understood propaganda. Edward Bernays, of course, was later hired by the American Tobacco Company, Lucky Strike, to convince women they should smoke. Now, when I went to medical school, why, cancer of the lung was quite common in men, but very uncommon in women. But Edward Bernays was the master propagandist, and using all the facilities of American Tobacco Company, he launched a massive campaign to get women to smoke. And today, the second most common cancer that's killing women in America is cancer of the lung, thanks to Edward Bernays. And Edward Bernays, of course, was hired by other companies to do similar things, but he was hired by the United States Public Health Service to convince the American people that the poison, an industrial poison, fluoride, was really a panacea. His job was to change the perception of the problem, to convince us that we could use this pollutant so we would have perpetual pretty smiles and perfect teeth. And Edward Bernays succeeded. They planted people in the American Dental Association. They planted people in the American Medical Association. They spent a great deal of money on advertising. We did not yet have television at that time. This was 1950, and television was only becoming, well, just beginning to come in at that time. But they used the movies. They used everything possible to convince us that water fluoridation was good. And anybody who didn't believe that believed there was a communist under every bed. The people who opposed fluoride believed this was a communist plot. And believe me, to an extent it was. I mean, every communist, I've read the communist publications, every communist supports water fluoridation because they know how corrupting it is. In fact, the communists actually used fluoridated water in the Gulag because it has an effect on the mind. And we can get into these things and the documentation of that later. That's why, of course, the communists fluoridated the water in eastern Germany. And, of course, once the Berlin Wall came down, why they stopped water fluoridation. And people aren't very industrious over there, but their teeth are a lot better, less dental caries since they stopped water fluoridation. So the U.S. Public Health Service used massive amounts of money to push industry's plan to convince the American people that there was no problem. Then in 1955, why they completed the 10-year study of the water fluoridation program in Newburgh, New York. And they came out with glowing reports of how much less dental caries there was there. But they did comment on the fact that girls were entering their menarche 6 to 9 months earlier in Newburgh, New York. They did not mention that there was twice as much heart disease in Newburgh, New York than in Kingston, New York. So then in 1956, why the Journal of the American Medical Association, remember the report is issued in 1955, the second report. 1956, JAMA puts out an article, says you can have up to 40 milligrams of fluoride a day. It's perfectly safe. And the authority for that was a man named Dr. Harold Hodge, who'd been employed by the CIA and the Atomic Energy Commission. In about 1968, there was a doctor named Walbach. And he was a physician. He noticed that there were a lot of people who just couldn't take fluoride. They had an awful reaction to it. He formed an organization known as the Institute for Fluoride Research and began publishing a magazine called Fluoride, where all of the leading chemists could write their articles, because chemists know how deadly a poison this is. Chemists know what this does to the body. And so there are all sorts of peer-reviewed articles. But the problem is that PubMed, which is an excellent source of medical information, PubMed won't refer at all to Fluoride magazine. And the medical newsletter won't refer to the magazine. And efforts to get the truth out to doctors and dentists and professionals across the country have been very effectively blocked by a massive propaganda campaign. So that today the average person has no idea we are being slowly and intentionally poisoned. 1970, the Clean Air Act came out. Oh, we were going to control nitrous oxide and sulfur emissions and mercury emissions. Not one word about fluoride in the Clean Air Act. 1977, there were congressional hearings, and the congressman wanted to know if there was any relationship between water fluoridation and cancer. 12 years later, they started the study. Why would you wait 12 years later after being ordered by Congress to study and find out if there was any relationship, between cancer and water fluoridation? And of course the studies came out and said yes, that there was a definite relationship. But of course they changed the results. There was a man named Dr. William Marcus. And Dr. Marcus was a senior toxicologist in the Department of Water Safety. And he objected to the fact that they had simply doctored the report, because at least in the animal studies it showed there were cancers. And what happened to Dr. Marcus? He was immediately fired. Well, Dr. Marcus mortgaged his home, and he actually took the case to court. He won the case. He got back his job, but nobody in America ever heard about Dr. William Marcus. What had happened to him was like remembrance of yesterday's sunset. simply long since gone. But it was a good lesson, of course, to others that you better not speak up and tell the truth, that they're poisoning the American people. In 1992, Dr. Lyons published an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association pointing out that in communities where they had fluoridated water, you had twice the incidence of hip fractures in postmenopausal women as in areas where they didn't have fluoridated water. In 1994, Dr. Frenny, and for those of you who want to document what I'm saying, we put it all together in this syllabus, and you'll see copies of all of these articles which we've gotten, many of them from the Fluoride Journal, which had given me permission to reprint them. You'll find them here, about how the sperm motility goes down and the testosterone level goes down in men. And you wonder why so many men have sexual dysfunction. Well, fluoride poisons their endocrine system, and they get low testosterone levels, they get obesity and sexual dysfunction, and they've known that. They just don't want the people of this country to know what's really going on. All the studies are there, and you'll read them in the references to so many other sources. But you see, they have to keep this secret from the American people. Dr. Frenny, in 1994, published his study. He was basically a scientist. He was commissioned to find if there was any relationship between fertility rates and water fluoridation. And as he studied communities all across the country, comparing communities that were fluoridated and not, if you were fluoridated, your fertility level went down. If you weren't fluoridated, your fertility level went up. The higher the fluoride, the lower the fertility. The lower the fertility, the lower the fluoride, the higher the fertility. Dr. Frenny was threatened, told not to publish his article here in the American media. Could things like that really go on in the United States? And Rush Limbaugh and Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw would never tell us. Well, of course, Tom and Dan aren't there anymore, but what about all the others? Why aren't they telling us about these things? In 1994, Dr. Phyllis Mullinex, and you can actually get interviews with some of these people. We have them over there, and my 4 tapes that's on full interview with Dr. Phyllis Mullinex. Dr. Phyllis Mullinex was an up-and-coming scientist. She was very sought after. She was appointed to one of the most prestigious positions in the country, a researcher at the Forsyth Dental Research Institute affiliated with Harvard University. And she was asked to see what effect fluoridated water had on rats. And so she came up with some sort of a system she called a computer pattern recognition system, or CPRS. And it was computerized. You didn't have to give your opinion. Somehow or other, the computer was actually able to watch the activities of rats. And, of course, there would be rats that were fed fluoridated water and rats that weren't. Female rats that drank fluoridated water had hyperactive offspring. In other words, ADHD, like comparable to what we see in human beings. The attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Male baby rats that drank fluoridated water developed cognitive defects, and female baby rats developed problems later, and they got sort of like couch potatoes. They didn't want to do much of anything. They just sort of sat around. They were all rats just sitting there. Well, with Dr. Mullinex, when she came up with the results, and it was all put out by her computer, she reported this at some meetings, and she was told, don't publish that. And she was threatened, and she was told if she published it, she'd lose her job, and she published it because she was naive. She thought that science was the search for truth, and you never guess what happened. She lost her job. But we still have the opportunity. In fact, we have a video over here, a DVD, and you'll actually see an interview with her. That's drinking water safety. It was put together by our good friend, Dr. David Kennedy, and you'll see Dr. Mullinex telling the story. Dr. Hardy Limeback is the chairman of the Department of Preventive Dentistry at the University of Toronto. And Dr. Limeback began to study this issue. Of course, he was totally in favor of water fluoridation until he began doing some study, which most dentists never do. And he realized that they're not putting fluoride into water. They're putting something called hydrofluorosilicic acid, which is a compound of fluoride, lead, arsenic, cadmium, polonium-20, which is a radioactive substance that breaks down to lead. Why would they be putting lead and arsenic into our water? Well, because this comes from the smokestacks of the phosphate industry. They have scrubbers in these smokestacks because this is too toxic to release into the general atmosphere. After all, these people would go to jail if you were to release this substance into the atmosphere. It's too toxic to put into rivers or lakes, or it's so toxic it's very difficult to put it into toxic dumps. It will eat right through metal. So what they do is they put it in special tanks that are lined with rubber, and they truck it to our local communities. They put it on our water system with the idea that if we dilute it, then we just don't have to worry so much. The trouble is that if there's fluoridated water, and they've done the studies, then all the children in those areas have high levels of lead. There is no safe level of lead at all. And then we wonder, so many of our children, minds are not clear. All of this, I mean, we've got the documentation on everything we're telling you. Well, Dr. Hardy Limbach, when he realized what was going on, began to speak out on this. And you'll see on this DVD we have over here, an interview with Dr. Limbach where he tells you essentially what I have. I personally called Dr. Limbach and I said, I'd like you to come on my radio program. He said, oh, I'd like to, but I can't. I've been threatened. I'm not going to risk my family and my children and my job on this issue, but you can read what I've said up on the internet, but I've been threatened. I've been told not to speak out on this again. Well, in 1995, Dr. Kumar wrote an analysis of the original Newburgh-Kingston study that had begun 50 years ago. Remember, the study began in 1945, so his article is in 1955. Pardon me, his article is written in 1995, 50 years later. And so we've actually then went to the people. It was published in the New York Dental Association Journal. So I sent them an email and I said, gee, I'd like your permission to go ahead and, first of all, could you give me a copy of the article? And then secondly, could I publish that in a syllabus I'm putting together for our people who want to learn about fluoride? And I get the letter back, your request to obtain the reproduction right to the article by Dr. Kumar appeared in 1998 in the New York Dental Journal. The authors of the article didn't transfer the copyright to us, and therefore I'm unable to give you permission, etc., etc. In other words, you can't publish it. Well, first we had the article. I just wanted to see what they're going to say. And basically he says that water fluoridation works great. The incidence of dental caries is down in Newburgh, but it's also down in Kingston and all other areas. The declining trend in dental caries is apparent in both Newburgh and Kingston. Didn't make a bit of difference. But they can't come out and admit that. Then in the year 2000, there was a fellow named Dr. Featherstone. And Dr. Featherstone wrote an article that was published by the Journal of the American Dental Association. And in that article, why he said, it doesn't do any good to drink the water. Fluoride acts locally. And exactly as I told you earlier, it is a bactericidal agent. It is the fluoride that kills the bacteria. And in the toothpaste, it works very well. And then if you read the article, he sort of dances all around the issue of what happens, but he says it doesn't do any good to ingest it. So if it doesn't do any good to ingest it, why are we ingesting it? Well, anyway, of course, I wrote to the American Dental Association, asked for permission to reproduce the article, and I got back this very nice letter saying, no, you can't reproduce the article, but since the CDC had put out exactly the same material, I have it here in the syllabus, and you can read, or they tell you, it acts locally, it does not act systemically. And then, of course, the following year, by the CDC and the American Pediatric Association, the ADA got together. And by this time, it was obvious that we had all sorts of dental fluorosis and we had toxicity. Now, for 50 years, they've been recommending that children be given fluoride supplements. Pregnant women were giving, vitamins that contained fluoride in it, which was poisoning the children. And newborn children were being sent home with fluoride drops to protect their teeth. The only trouble was that we were poisoning our children. And by 2001, they finally have realized the terrible mistake they'd made. But how can you possibly admit you've made a mistake? So they came up with recommendations. We have them here. If a child is between birth and 6 months of age, no matter how much fluoride there's in the water, you shouldn't give them any fluoride supplements. If they're 6 months to 3 years and there's less than 0.25 milligrams per day, well, that's a very, very small amount of fluoride in the water. You can give them some fluoride supplements, but other than that, not. And basically what they're really telling you is if you have fluoridated water, do not give your children any fluoride supplements, but they've been doing it for 50 years. This is the CDC's publication. Of course, it's all right here. And you have to understand, they've systematically poisoned the American people. Now, what are the sources of fluoride? Well, you get fluoride in just about everything. You get it in your Wheaties, you get it in your Cokes, you get it in your Pepsis, you get it on your lettuce because, of course, they spray our fruits and vegetables to kill the pesticides, and this kills the insects on contact. It also totally disrupts your endocrine system when you eat, when you consume the fluoride. And we've taken simply a list of all the places that you're going to get fluoride here, so you can put them down. And then we have included a list of letters from all the countries of Europe asking if they fluoridate their water. None of them fluoridate the water. They do put fluoride into the salt in Switzerland, but that is for fertility control. How do I know that? Well, because we have a book called Man and His Future, published in 1962 by SIBA, and they were talking at that time. The elite, the Julius Huxleys and the Francis Crick and the other people, these elitists, were talking about how they were going to put things in the water to control fertility, and somebody said, well, look, they're putting the fluoride into the salt in Switzerland, maybe we ought to do that. And people said, it really doesn't work very well. You can't tell how much salt people are going to use. But you've got articles here from Brussels and Belgium and Denmark, and there's only places that they fluoridate the water. Poor Irish, about 50% of their areas are fluoridated. I think there are maybe 10 to 12% in Great Britain and no place else. In fact, there's an article here from India saying, why you want to fluoridate your water? We're trying to get fluoride out of your water. China doesn't fluoridate their water. They're trying to get it out of their water. Japan doesn't fluoridate their water. We are part of a great experiment to see how they can control our population by, of course, dumbing down the American people. And, of course, you have to understand that there is so much information. Of course, we've just put this all together here. There's testimony by Dr. Richard Mass that was given. He's an expert on water fluoridation, pointing out, of course, there is no set level of lead, but we're putting it in water. 67% of the water systems of this country. And yet there's now 1 in 1,000 Americans who realize what's really going on. So as we try to make any sense out of what's going on, it was in the year 2000 that Dr. Hersey, who testified before the United States Senate. Now, Dr. Hersey works in for the Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Water Purity, and of course, he's protected by his union. He was representing his union when he went before the Senate, and we have his testimony here, and he simply points out it attacks the mind, it attacks the fertility, it attacks the endocrine system. The complete testimony is there. You can go to my website at radioliberty.com. That's radioliberty.com, and pull down my December 2004 newsletter. And we've included Dr. Hersey's entire testimony, and not one word of it released by the media. Dr. Paul Conant is a professor of chemistry at one of the major universities, and Dr. Paul Conant put up a website, and we've, of course, given you the references to it here in my syllabus, but it's called fluoridealert.org. And it simply gives you references to all of the scientific studies that show that they're poisoning us, our children, and our grandchildren. The American Dental Association, in their effort to get information out, set up a parallel website, fluoridealert.com. And, of course, most people don't remember whether it's org or com. They go to fluoridealert.com, and where do you think you end up? Why, with the American Dental Association telling you how wonderful fluoride is. If I could suggest you're only going to get one thing, get our hidden agenda syllabus, and then, of course, remember what we've told you today, or hopefully we'll have this available, when Rob gets these finished. But you must understand that there is a conscious effort to keep the American people from understanding what is really going on in the world today. Now, how do then we begin to make any sense out of what I've told you? And I simply have to point out that we know that fluoride decreases fertility, decreases sperm motility, decreases sperm count. We know that fluoride lowers the intelligence, and in China, and there are all sorts of studies, you can actually read them, it'll take 10 to 15 points off your child's IQ, and if your child's got an IQ of 165 or 70, they're going to be pretty smart. If they got an IQ of 85, imagine what it's going to do to them. It also produces cancer, they know this, It increases fragility of the bone. It attacks the thyroid, and we have so many people with hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism today, and nobody can quite figure out, and so many people are rupturing their tendons because the fluoride attacks their tendons, the collagen there. It attacks the endocrine system, and this is the reason why so many girls are going through premature menarche. It leads to arthritis, it leads to infirmity, it leads to heart disease, and all of these things are known. And yet the average American has no idea what's going on. So if all of these things are true, why is the UN's Public Health Service promoting water fluoridation? Well, first there's one explanation, and that is that the atomic energy needed to enrich uranium. After all, we had to win the Second World War, and they had to lie to the American people that the industries in America faced tremendous losses, and so we had to change the perception of fluoride. We had to make this industrial poison to be a panacea. We had to change the perception of the problem. There is certainly a great book. It's written by Dr. Swinburne Clymer. It's called The Age of Treason. And of course, in that book, he talks about how fluoride was used by the Nazis in the occupied areas. They didn't use it in Germany. They just fluoridated the water in the occupied areas to control the people. How, of course, the Russians used fluoridated water in the Gulag, and how the Chinese had used fluoridated water. The emperors had used it for years to control fertility in China, so they wouldn't have too many people. Well, is there another agenda? And I would like to suggest that there is another agenda. And just as Dr. Ayoub, when he was talking, had given you several possible explanations for what was going on. So I would like to give you what I believe is the real agenda. And so much of what Dr. Ayoub told you in the previous talk carries over into this one. There are people who have a different world view because they worship a different God. So let's go back to 1826 to a man named Thomas Malthus. You've probably heard the term Malthusian. Thomas Malthus was an Anglican churchman, or he worked for the British East India Company. In 1826, he wrote an essay on population, in which he said, well, either we're going to have to begin getting people to stop having children, or we're going to have to start building our cities next to stagnant ponds and encourage people not to be clean, and discourage anybody who tries to stop major plagues, because we must have major plagues to kill off large parts of the population. We've just got to stop the population from increasing. And so that became the Malthusian concept. And then, of course, in 1870, a man named Galton picked up the ideas of Malthus and transferred them to England here in the 1920s to a woman named Margaret Sanger, who actually was the founder of Planned Parenthood. But what everybody has missed about Margaret Sanger is she was also deeply involved in the occult. And until you understand that there is an occult background to so much of what's going on today, and these are the people who've tapped into this other dimension. There is another dimension. Those of you who watch television on Monday night see a program called The Medium. And it's a wonderful story about this just delightful woman, the mother of three of the most beautiful little children with such an understanding husband, but she has the ability to tap into the other dimension to help, of course, the district attorney catch the bad guys. And fascinating, the trouble is, there really is another dimension there. There are people who can tap into the other dimension. We've talked to many of them. In fact, I got an infuriated letter from a witch one time who disagreed with something I'd said on nationwide television. And she said, you know, I'm a witch. But you must understand, I'm a good witch. And, I mean, there's a few bad witches out there, but I'm a good witch. And, of course, we cast our spells and go through our rites only so we can contact the beings from the other dimension. This is not make-believe. If you read the Bible, you'll find all sorts of references to it, for we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. And there is another dimension there. Well, anyway, Margaret Sanger was into theosophy and the other dimension. And of course, her ideas of genetics, and of course, here in the United States, we sterilize about 60,000 inferior people. And many of the ideas, of course, were taken over in Hitler's Germany, did not come from Germany to America. They came from America to Germany. And many of the laws that we had passed here to legalize the sterilization of those who were not fit to reproduce were simply adopted in Germany and carried on to their logical conclusion. In China, of course, when the Chinese came to power, why, they systematically killed about 40 million people, and then between 1958 and 1962, they starved to death between 43 and 46 million people, according to the Chinese Communist records. It's covered in Stephen Moser's book, Mother's Ordeal. There's another book called The Hungry Ghost. That fellow, he's a piker. He thinks there were only about 30 million they killed. If somebody had starved to death 30 million, or 40 million, or 46 million people, don't you think that would be covered somewhere in the American media? Called The Great Hunger in China. You'll find a few references to up on the internet, but it's well documented in Chinese literature because Stephen Moser, who I consider a friend for population control research, is actually there and knew the people who'd done the studies, the Chinese who'd actually gone through the government records. Between 41 and 43 million people systematically starved to death, and not a word in the American media. But, of course, if you believe in population control, that's a very efficient means of getting rid of a lot of people. Bertrand Russell, writing in his book, The Impact of Science on Society in 1953, and this is really a very, very important reference. We got permission from the publisher actually to reproduce those pages, and you'll find them here in the syllabus. And he's simply talking about, how if we could just by diet, injections, and injunctions, we're going to be able to alter the precepts of the people. Diet, injections, or injunctions. We're going to will be combined to be able to control the attitudes of people. What do you think they're going to put in the diet that's going to change our mental outlook? He also talks about how if we just had a black plague sweep the world once every generation, then people could have all the children they want to. And we wouldn't have to worry about having too many people. The pages are here. We've reproduced them with permission. I think it's very important. You see what these people write. And then, of course, 4 years later, 1957, Swinburne Clymer writes his book, The Age of Treason, to counter what Bertrand Russell has said, and said, this is immoral. And then he points out how fluoride is being used to control population, and, of course, to dull down the mentality of the people, both in communist Russia and in Hitler's Germany. Well, then we can fast forward to 1962 when Francis Crick, and he worked on the development of the spiral nature of DNA, and he attended a meeting called Man and His Future, put on by the SIBA, and we've got a copy of it. And Francis Crick and Julian Huxley, who was the first Secretary General of UNESCO and the brother of Aldous Huxley, and they're all standing around as, what can we put into the food that will cut down on population? We've just got to stop there being so many people. And here's where they talk about, well, the Swiss actually put, fluoride into their salt. But it doesn't seem to work very well because how do we know how much salt they're going to use? And then, of course, in 1962, Rachel Carson writes a book, The Silent Spring. Man is the real danger of everything. There are too many, we're going to have to do something. DDT's killing us off. Man is the real enemy of nature. 1969. And you'll find the quotation actually here, pages from the government testimony, 1969. Dr. Richard Day goes before a group of doctors, and he begins talking about the plan of the order to transform a society. Now, Dr. Richard Day is the head of the Planned Parenthood. He's the medical director of Planned Parenthood at that time. And he talks about, well, there are too many people in the world, there are lots of treatments for cancer, and we're going to keep them concealed within the files of the Rockefeller Foundation. And, of course, people are going to have to die of something, so they might as well die of cancer. We're going to create new diseases for killing off large numbers of people. It's amazing. It's just simply a transcript of interviews with a Dr. Dunnigan, who actually had heard the talk by Dr. Day. Now, that was May of 1969. 3 months later, testifying before the House Appropriations Committee on Military Affairs, Dr. David MacArthur asks the members of Congress in attendance, for $10 million to create a new disease. Now, this is 1969. He says, we have the capacity to create a new disease for which there will be no immune response. Now, some people think we shouldn't do this because it's a new means of mass killing, but we want to do it. And 10 years later, first cases of AIDS appeared in 1979. We didn't recognize it till 1881, but they were there. They just didn't know what they were. We have the ability to create new diseases. And if you want to know the background and want to certainly be able to verify that we did actually create the AIDS epidemic, man-made, you'll want to get this planned population reduction, actually references to several who have actually come forward and said, I was part of the project. But they don't want you to know about that. Because think of the implication. Why, that would be genocide. You'd have to be tried for an international trial for murder. And they're never going to allow the American people to understand the implications of what I've just told you. In 1972, the Club of Rome, which is made up of the elite of Europe, people like, well, Gorbachev. Gorbachev wasn't a member in 72, but he later joined that, but Maurice Strong, and the people who control the industries of Europe, the royalty of Europe, the banking of Europe, the elite who really rule the world in the Club of Rome, put together a book called The Limits of Growth. And in The Limits of Growth, they talked about sustainable development. We're running out of water. We're running out of oil. We're running out of natural resources. There are too many people in the world. We've got to have sustainable development. And that's where sustainable development began. It was back in 1972 in a book called The Limits of Growth. And of course, later that year, they had the first Earth Summit meeting, and of course, there was Maurice Strong. And you remember earlier we talked about how Maurice Strong and Gorbachev and Stephen Rockefeller had written the Earth Charter, the new 10 Commandments for the world that is now contained in the Ark of Hope, the satanic counterpart of the Ark of the Covenant. Well, 1973, Williams Ruckelshaus, who heads the EPA, outlaws DDT. Not because DDT was dangerous to humanity. It was the safest pesticide we've ever had. We'd be far better off spraying DDT on our lettuce than spraying fluoride, which has the devastating effects on us. And you can get our 4 tapes out on population control and my talks with Dr. G. Gordon Edwards, who used to give talks on DDT, and it always started out with taking a tablespoonful of DDT and eating it before he'd begin to give the talk, just to show you how safe this really was. And it really was safe. As a result of what, of course, William Ruckelshaus did, between 90 and 100 million people have died of malaria in the intervening years, about 3 million a year. Of course, now they've lowered the figure. They keep changing the figures. You know, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And it always used to be everybody knew 3 million people died of malaria every year, but recently it's fallen to 1 million. And they're simply lying because they hate to admit all the people that they've killed. In 1973, Family Planning Perspective magazine, which is published in Santa Cruz, California by Guttmacher Institute, which is a subdivision of Planned Parenthood, publishes, and you'll actually see the page here, they publish how are we going to control the population? Well, first of all, we need a marriage tax. You ever wonder why we have a marriage tax? The IRS has it set up so it's more expensive to get married than not to be married. You ever wonder why that is? It really doesn't make sense, does it? Unless you understand that these people don't make mistakes. They know exactly what they don't want you to get married. Why? Married people have children. Of course, non-married people have children too, but there's a lot more chance you're going to have children if you're married than not, so we're going to make it more expensive for you. And then, of course, they talk about we want to encourage homosexuality. Why would anybody want to encourage people to go into homosexuality? Why? Because they don't reproduce and have children. And then we want to put something into the water. It's all right here. You'll find it in the book. Page, we got their permission to put that into our syllabus. You must understand these people know exactly what they're doing. They just don't want you to know. And then, of course, there are other references. For 1974, over Henry Kissinger's signature is published the National Security Study Memorandum 200. The master plan for depopulation of the world. And of course, Dr. Ayub was talking about that in his presentation. Very important. It was actually top secret for many years. It has been declassified. You can pull it down off the internet, or you can get at least some references to it in our syllabus, although we have the entire study report, but you can actually pull it down off the internet. NSSM 200. And what they say is we've got to restrict population throughout the rest of the world. First of all, in the developed countries, and then, of course, in the underdeveloped countries. And that's why we give all of these, hundreds of millions of dollars every year to the United Nations the Family Planning Association, why we finance abortion in China, why we finance abortion throughout the rest of the world, why we put those contraceptive vaccines out. And I've talked to people from Kenya and from the Philippines, both where they, without knowledge of women, they've given them contraceptive vaccines so they can't conceive and taken away the most important thing a woman can have, the ability to have children. But you see, these evil and wicked people have no human compassion. They just have a goal, and that is sustainable development. And then, of course, in 1979, in Alberton, Georgia, a man walks into one of the local granite companies. And Alberton is on the northeastern part of Georgia, and they have granite, large granite deposits there, and they make gravestones. But a man walked in and announced he wanted them to build a monument, and he represented a secret group. He said his name was R.C. Christian, but it really wasn't. Everybody knew that was not his real name, and nobody to this date knows who the secret group is he represented. But you can go to Alberton, Georgia. You go to my webpage, and you'll see pictures of the Georgia Guidestones. It took a year or so before they were actually built. They're used as a satanic center, and they have satanic parties and naked parties, and the UFOs have been seen hovering over the area. I've been there. I've been through all the files there at the library. This is the satanic center. It's the American counterpart of the English Stonehenge and of the other temples that are built to the occult. The Great Pyramids are actually part of this whole concept of sun worship. That's why you have them on the back of your dollar bill. It's all part of this world occult movement. And they hide their emblems in plain sight, and most people have never heard them. But the important thing about the Georgia Guidestones, which were ultimately dedicated, I believe, in 1980, is that there are 10 commandments. They're written in 8 different languages, in English and Russian and Spanish and Swahili and Hebrew and Hindi and Chinese, and I forgot the other one. But of course, point number 1 is maintain the world population of 500 million in constant balance with nature, which doesn't really sound too bad unless you understand that there are over 6 million people here, and they're talking about killing off over 90% of the world's population. And there really are people who have a different worldview because they worship a different God. 1991, we had the Gulf War. Somewhere between a third and half of the young men who went over to that are ill today. And we have the reports of the government going into the background of the Gulf War illness. 30% of the young men who are coming back from the recent Gulf War, within 3 months of coming home, are now ill. They say it must be post-traumatic stress syndrome. Oh, it couldn't be anything else. Oh, we're simply poisoning our young people. And many of them, of course, will be infertile, and many of the children will be born deformed. And about 40% of the wives of the veterans of the first Gulf War illness, have to contract the Gulf War illness from their husbands, which is in some form a communicable disease. There's a wonderful book over here written by a former professor at MD Anderson Clinic. It's called Project Daylily. Project Daylily was the code word for creating the AIDS epidemic and all the new diseases. And of course, Dr. Garth Nicholson, who I consider a friend, has stumbled onto this when he was a tenured professor. His closest associate there was murdered. A number of his students were murdered. It's an incredible story. It's written as fiction, but it's really true. As he says, I just changed the name so I wouldn't get sued. They've tried to kill him many times. Project Daylily, I hope we have some copies in. If you don't, you'll want to get it from us, going to how they created all these new diseases here in this country. We do know that in 1991, Jacques Cousteau, that great humanitarian who swims with the dolphins, gave an interview before the UNESCO Courier, November 1991, and if you want a copy, we'll be glad to get it for you, in which he said, it's a terrible thing to say, but we're going to have to eliminate 325,000 people a day. Terrible thing to say, but we're going to have to do it to bring the earth back into balance. You have to understand that we are involved in a spiritual battle for the souls of men, and water fluoridation is simply one part of this. Water fluoridation, the NutraSweet, which is in our product, which is a deadly poison, and yet they know it impacts upon the whole endocrine system and upon the mind and produces cancer. So using between fluoride, between mercury in the vaccines, and the aluminum in the vaccines, and water, we are under attack today. Now, we can do one of several things. We can go home and ignore what you've heard, or you can try to prove me wrong. I hope you'll want to get our material. And, of course, you can go to my website and pull down my articles. And, of course, get many of the other websites that are out there, fluoridealert.org. Don't go to .com. fluoridealert.org. Dr. Potter. Get those articles. Put together your own syllabus. Learn how to present this. Learn my little mnemonic, Fluoride. Fertility lowers intelligence. U, undifferentiated cells, which is cancer. O for osseous or bone. R for thyroid. I for infirmity. D for dental fluorosis. E for endocrine dysfunction and heart disease. Learn how to present it. Have the documents before you. Concede the point that dental and oral health is far better than it was 50 years ago. But at what cost? And have the material available for you and present it and present it effectively. And I believe that this is the most important issue we can utilize at the present time because it affects every person in the United States. And only when people realize that they are under attack, that it is they that may very well become ill or that their children. And when they begin to understand it's going to take 10 to 15 IQ points off of their children and grandchildren. At that point, people are going to begin to try to prove you wrong, and when they find you're right, then hopefully they will join us in this epic struggle for the survival of Western civilization and for the souls of men. Because behind everything that's going on, as you've heard me say so many times, is this spiritual battle, this eternal spiritual battle that has been here since the inception of mankind and will be waged until a man is no longer here on the earth. We've all been called home. But we are called to do our best. And let me simply remind you, as we're told in the book of Ephesians, for put ye on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. God bless you. Thank you so much. I wasn't waiting for a standing ovation.